This is not a story about champagne. It's a story about how we learned to make desire fizz. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not a story about celebration or luxury or French elegance draped across magazine spreads. This is a story about how human beings learned to trap lightning in a bottle and then spent 3 centuries turning that accident into a weapon of class, a weapon of empire, a weapon of desire so precisely calibrated that the sound of a cork leaving glass can make a room hold its breath. Champagne is not merely a drink. It is a social technology, a class marker refined across generations, a liquid that taught the world how to perform wealth, how to signal status, how to turn fermented grapes and trapped carbon dioxide into the sound of power itself. If you find these long, calm documentaries useful, take a moment now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. There's something quietly beautiful about seeing the map of listeners spread across the night, each of us carrying our own thoughts into sleep. And now, settle in, phone face down, screen dimmed. Let the room go dark around the edges. We're going to follow champagne across 3 centuries, not to celebrate it, and not to condemn the people who drink it, but to understand the machinery that made it unavoidable, how a monastic problem became an imperial tool, how a regional wine became the universal language of aspiration, how bubbles in a bottle became inseparable from war, revolution, aristocracy, and the endless human hunger to mark ourselves as different, as elevated, as worthy of what sparkles. By the time we reach the modern era, champagne will have survived revolutions and world wars, occupied trenches and nightclub tables, toasted emperors and oligarchs. And even then, the story will not end. It will simply change shape and move into the air we all share. But to understand how something so small could become so powerful, we have to begin earlier, before the golden labels, before the luxury conglomerates, before the myth. In the beginning, there were no bubbles, only cold stone cellars, patient monks, and wine that refused to behave. The year is 1668. The place is the Abbey of Haute-Villers, a Benedictine monastery perched on a hillside overlooking the Marne River in the Champagne region of northern France. The landscape is beautiful but unforgiving. The climate is marginal for viticulture, cold enough that grapevines struggle, warm enough that they persist. The wine produced here is thin, acidic, unremarkable. Burgundy to the south makes better wine. Everyone knows this. It is a quiet shame the region carries like a birthmark. And then there is the problem of the bubbles. In the spring, as temperatures rise and the cellars warm, something strange happens. The wine, which had seemed finished, begins to ferment again. Pressure builds inside the bottles. Corks are pushed out with violent pops. Glass shatters in the dark. In bad years, up to 90% of the bottles explode, turning the cellars into dangerous, expensive graveyards of broken glass and wasted labor. The monks call it the devil's wine. It is unpredictable. It is costly. It is a problem that needs solving. Enter Dom Pierre Perignon. Born in 1638 in the village of Saint Menehould, Pierre Perignon took his vows as a Benedictine monk and arrived at the Abbey of Haute-Villers in 1668, where he was appointed cellar master. He would hold this position for 47 years until his death in 1715. History remembers him as the inventor of champagne, the man who first tasted the bubbles and declared in wonder, "Come quickly, I am drinking stars." It is a beautiful story. It is also almost certainly a lie. There is no contemporary source for that quote. No letter, no diary entry, no abbey record from the 17th or 18th century that documents Dom Perignon ever saying those words. The phrase first appears in the 19th century in an advertisement, at a time when champagne houses were learning the modern art of mythology. The quote is not history, it is marketing. The truth is quieter, and in its own way, more tragic. Dom Perignon did not invent champagne. He spent decades trying to prevent it. His actual contributions to winemaking were significant but technical. He pioneered the blending of grapes from different vineyards, creating more complex and balanced wines through assemblage. He improved viticulture practices in the abbey's holdings, pruning vines more carefully, selecting better rootstock. He experimented with cork stoppers imported from Spain, which formed tighter seals than the oil-soaked hemp traditionally used. He advocated for thicker glass bottles, understanding that stronger vessels could better withstand pressure. But the bubbles themselves, he fought them. In his meticulous records, now preserved in fragments,
And studied by historians, Dom Perignon's concern is clear. He sought to produce still wine, vin tranquille, the wine that would not re-ferment, that would not explode, that would not embarrass the abbey or bankrupt its operations. The secondary fermentation that created the bubbles was not a feature to be celebrated, it was a flaw to be eliminated. He could not have known that the very techniques he developed to control the wine, the stronger bottles, the better corks, the careful blending, would become the foundation for intentionally producing sparkling wine decades after his death. He could not have known that his name would become synonymous with luxury, with celebration, with the very bubbles he spent a lifetime trying to stop. This is the deep irony at the heart of champagne's origin. The man history credits with its invention saw it as a failure. The process he refined was an attempt to achieve the opposite of what champagne would become. He died in 1715, never having embraced the effervescence, never having seen the bubbles as anything but a problem that good technique and patient discipline should be able to solve. In the cold stone cellars of Houtvillers, lit by candlelight and smelling faintly of fermentation and damp earth, Dom Perignon worked. He tasted, he blended, he waited. And in the spring, when the temperatures rose and the cellars warmed, the wine began to fizz again, despite his best efforts. The pressure built, the corks strained, and sometimes in the dark, a bottle would explode with a sound like a gunshot, glass shards scattering across the floor. The devil's wine, unpredictable, expensive, persistent. What Dom Perignon tried to stop, the world would learn to crave. But that transformation would not come from the abbey. It would come from the realization, slow and reluctant, that what one monk saw as failure, a market might see as magic. But what one monk tried to stop, an entire region would learn to embrace. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened slowly across decades as winemakers in the Champagne region began to ask a different question. Not how do we stop the bubbles, but how do we control them? If we cannot eliminate the problem, can we turn it into a product? By the early 18th century, the answer was beginning to take shape. The English, ironically, had already developed a taste for sparkling wine from Champagne, calling it brisk or foaming. They had access to stronger glass bottles, produced in coal-fired furnaces that could reach higher temperatures than French wood-fired kilns. English glass could withstand 6 or more atmospheres of pressure without shattering. French winemakers began importing these bottles, and suddenly the explosive losses began to decline. Then came the cork, Spanish and Portuguese oak bark, harvested and processed into stoppers that could be compressed, inserted into bottlenecks, and secured. Unlike the oil-soaked hemp or wooden plugs previously used, cork formed an airtight seal while remaining flexible enough to withstand pressure. It was a small innovation that changed everything. To keep the corks from launching like projectiles, winemakers tied them down with twine, and later with twisted wire cages called mousselets. The bottles could now be sealed, stored on their sides, and aged without catastrophic failure. But the wine inside was still cloudy. Dead yeast cells, the lees, remained suspended in the liquid after secondary fermentation, making the champagne murky and unappetizing to those accustomed to clear wines. Drinking champagne meant drinking sediment. It was rustic, unrefined, a luxury product that looked like peasant wine. This is where Barbe Nicole Ponsardin enters the story. Born in 1777 in Reims, she married François Clicquot in 1798, joining one of the region's established wine-producing families. When her husband died suddenly in 1805, she was 27 years old, a widow with a young daughter and a struggling wine business in a world that did not expect women to run commercial enterprises. She could have withdrawn. Instead, she took control. Veuve Clicquot, the widow Clicquot, would run the House of Clicquot for the next 61 years until her death in 1866, and in that time she would revolutionize the production of champagne. Her greatest innovation came in 1816, a technique so elegant in its simplicity that it seems obvious in hindsight, yet no one had thought of it before. She invented the riddling table, a pupitre in French. It was an A-frame wooden rack with angled holes, each size to hold a bottle by the neck. The bottles were placed in the holes at a slight downward angle, and each day cellar workers would give each bottle a slight twist and tilt it further toward vertical. Slowly, over weeks, gravity and careful manipulation drew the sediment down into the neck of the bottle, collecting it near the cork. Once the sediment was gathered, the neck of the bottle could be frozen, the cork
removed, and the frozen plug of yeast expelled in a process called disgorgement.
What remained was crystal-clear sparkling wine. The cloudy peasant drink was now as visually refined as it was expensive. This was méthode champenoise, the traditional method. It required patience. It required skill. Each bottle passed through more than 200 individual manipulations from harvest to sale. Cellar workers spent hours in dim, cool caves, turning bottles one by one, a choreography of craft performed in silence and repetition. The labor was invisible to the consumer. What they saw was elegance. What they tasted was clarity. What they paid for was the illusion that luxury came effortlessly. But every bottle of champagne was, in truth, a monument to human stubbornness, to the refusal to accept that something beautiful could not also be controlled. The bubbles were no longer an accident. They were architecture, engineered effervescence, desire made predictable, repeatable, and endlessly profitable. The devil's wine had been tamed, and in taming it, the Champagne region had created something new. Not just a drink, but a technology of aspiration. But perfecting the bubbles was only the beginning. The real question was, who gets to drink them? By the middle of the 18th century, champagne had mastered its own production. The bottles no longer exploded. The wine was clear. The bubbles rose in elegant chains through golden liquid. But technical mastery alone does not create luxury. Luxury is not made in the cellar. It is made in the mind. And champagne's producers understood something fundamental about human desire. Association is everything. If you want to sell a product as exclusive, you must first make it the choice of those who define exclusivity. You must place it in the hands of kings. The court of Louis XV, who reigned from 1715 to 1774, became Champagne's first great stage. Versailles, with its mirrors and candlelight, its elaborate rituals of dining and display, was a theater of power where every gesture carried meaning. What the king drank mattered. What his mistresses preferred mattered. What appeared on the tables of nobles who competed for royal favor mattered intensely. Champagne appeared at court not by accident, but by design. The champagne houses of Reims and Epernay were not merely producers, they were early architects of luxury branding. They cultivated relationships with courtiers, they sent gifts to nobles, they ensured that their bottles appeared at the right banquets, in the right hands, at the right moments. This was not simply commerce, it was strategic positioning. The goal was to make champagne synonymous with sophistication itself, to embed it so deeply into the rituals of the elite that its absence would feel like a failure of taste. One of Champagne's most powerful advocates was Madame de Pompadour, the official chief mistress of Louis XV from 1745 until her death in 1764. Jean Antoinette Passon, as she was born, rose from the bourgeoisie to become one of the most influential women in France. A patron of the arts, a political advisor, and a woman whose opinions on fashion, culture, and consumption shaped the tastes of an entire generation. She famously declared that champagne was the only wine that leaves a woman beautiful after drinking it. The line is brilliant in its construction. It does not claim champagne makes you beautiful. It claims champagne preserves beauty, that it is the rare indulgence without consequence, the pleasure that does not betray you in the morning light. It was a message aimed directly at the aristocratic women who moved through Versailles and the salons of Paris, women for whom appearance was currency and reputation was fragile. Whether Madame de Pompadour actually said this, or whether it was later attributed to her by marketers who understood the power of her name, is almost irrelevant. The statement became truth through repetition, and champagne became the drink of women who wanted to be seen as elegant, refined, untouchable. But champagne's deepest connection to French royalty was geographic and ceremonial. Since the early Middle Ages, French kings had been crowned in the Cathedral of Reims, a Gothic masterpiece in the heart of the Champagne region. The coronation was not merely a religious ritual, it was a binding of the monarch to the sacred and the territorial, a physical rooting of royal authority in French soil. After the ceremony, the banquets that followed naturally featured the wines of the region. Champagne was not just present at these gatherings, it was symbolically woven into the fabric of kingship itself. To drink champagne was to participate, however distantly, in the rituals of sovereignty. To toast with champagne was to echo the gestures performed in the shadow of Reims Cathedral, where kings received their crowns and God's anointing. The glass itself evolved to match this elevated status. Early champagne was served in coupes, wide,
shallow bowls that allowed the bubbles to dissipate quickly. A persistent legend claims the coupe was modeled after the shape of Marie Antoinette's breast, cast in wax or porcelain at the royal manufactory. The story is false, as the coupe predates her, but the fact that such a myth emerged and persisted reveals something important. Champagne had entered the realm of erotic mythology. It was not merely a drink, it was intimacy, indulgence, the liquid form of aristocratic excess. Later, as understanding of carbonation improved, the flute replaced the coupe. Tall, narrow, designed to preserve the bubbles and concentrate the aroma, the flute was both functional and symbolic. It made the wine perform better. It also made the drinker look more refined, the glass held delicately between fingers, the bubbles visible as they rose. By 1789, on the eve of revolution, champagne had become inseparable from the identity of the French elite. It was no longer a regional wine. It was the drink of kings, of mistresses, of coronations and candlelit banquets. It was the taste of the ancien regime. And then came the revolution and the guillotine, and the question, can it drink survive the death of its class? The French Revolution began in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille and cascaded into a decade of violence, ideological fervor, and the systematic dismantling of the aristocratic order. The guillotine became the revolution's most potent symbol. King Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette followed in October of the same year. The nobles who had filled the salons and ballrooms of Versailles, who had toasted with champagne and performed their rituals of refinement, were now fleeing into exile, losing their heads, or desperately trying to blend into the new republic's austere identity. For champagne, this was a branding crisis of existential proportions. The drink had spent the better part of a century positioning itself as the nectar of royalty, the beverage of courts and coronations. It was associated deeply and visibly with the very class the revolution sought to destroy. Some champagne houses were vandalized, cellars were raided, owners fled. But the violence was less than one might expect, and for a practical reason, champagne was not merely a luxury, it was an industry. It employed workers. It was woven into the regional economy of Reims and Epernay. To destroy it entirely would be to impoverish thousands. And so champagne did what luxury always does when the old order collapses. It adapted. The houses did not change the product, they changed the customer. Revolutionary leaders, for all their rhetoric about equality and virtue, still needed to mark their own status, still needed rituals of celebration, still needed a way to toast victories and solemnize pacts. Champagne quietly repositioned itself. The same bottles that had graced royal banquets now appeared at revolutionary dinners. The same fizz that had marked aristocratic taste now signaled the refined palate of the new meritocratic elite. The liquid did not change, the story around it did. And then came Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican artillery officer who rose to become Emperor of the French, had a documented fondness for champagne, and in particular for the wines produced by the House of Moet. Jean-Remy Moet, grandson of the house's founder, understood the value of this relationship. He cultivated Napoleon's favor, hosting him at his estate in Epernay, providing champagne for his officers, ensuring that as Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, Moet's bottles marched with them. Napoleon reportedly said, "In victory you deserve champagne, in defeat you need it." Whether he actually spoke these words or whether they were later attributed to him by marketers who understood their elegance is once again less important than the fact that they became legend. The sentiment fit Napoleon's persona, practical, hedonistic, aware of morale's importance, and it gave champagne a new narrative, not merely the drink of Isle aristocrats, but the drink of conquerors, of men of action, of empire. Napoleon's relationship with champagne was strategic on both sides. For Napoleon, champagne was a tool of diplomacy and morale, a way to reward officers and celebrate victories. For the champagne houses, Napoleon was a walking advertisement, a man whose fame and mythos could carry their product into every corner of the continent his armies touched. The lesson of the revolutionary era was simple and brutal. Luxury is not loyal to a class, it is loyal to power. Whoever holds power can be taught to desire champagne, can be convinced that it marks them as sophisticated, as victorious, as belonging to the heights of human achievement. The revolution killed the aristocracy, but it did not kill the human hunger for symbols of status. Champagne simply found new throats to pour itself down. The product remained constant, the customer changed, and champagne, which had
seemed so fragile, so tied to the old regime, survived by proving it could belong to anyone who claimed to be exceptional. And as Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, so did the champagne. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, were catastrophic for Europe. Millions died, empires shifted, borders were redrawn with each campaign. But for the champagne houses of France, these wars became something else entirely, an export engine. French officers occupied Berlin, Vienna, Warsaw, Moscow. Everywhere the Grand Army went, victory banquets followed, and at those banquets, champagne flowed. It was not merely celebration, it was demonstration, a performance of French superiority that transcended military might,
and entered the realm of culture. The occupied cities watched French officers toast with sparkling wine, watched them perform rituals of elegance amid the chaos of conquest, and learned that this was what sophistication looked like. When the wars ended and the occupations lifted, the taste remained. Prussian nobles who had hosted French officers in Berlin began ordering champagne for their own tables. Austrian aristocrats in Vienna who had seen champagne at diplomatic dinners wanted it for their salons. The wine had been introduced not through trade missions or advertising, but through the intimate theater of occupation. The conquerors had taught the conquered how to drink like Frenchmen. This was cultural imperialism at its most seductive, not imposed by force, but by desire. Champagne did not demand adoption, it made itself irresistible. But the most audacious move in Champagne's conquest of Europe was not made by Napoleon. It was made by a widow who understood that chaos creates opportunity. In 1814, Napoleon's empire was collapsing. After the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and defeats across Germany, Allied forces pushed into France itself. Paris fell in March 1814. Russian troops, Prussian soldiers, Austrian regiments, armies from across Europe now occupied French soil. Napoleon abdicated in April and was exiled to Elba. For France, it was humiliation. For most French businesses, it was catastrophe. Barbe Nicole Ponsardin, the Veuve Clicquot, saw something else. She saw a market. While France was still reeling from defeat, while other champagne houses hesitated and assessed the damage, Madame Clicquot made a decision that was equal parts brilliant and reckless. She would smuggle champagne to Russia ahead of her competitors. Not wait for trade to normalize, not wait for peace treaties to be signed. She would move now while the routes were chaotic and the risk was enormous, because whoever captured the Russian market first would dominate it for decades. In June 1814, she arranged for a Dutch ship to carry more than 10,000 bottles of Veuve Clicquot champagne through a naval blockade across the Baltic Sea and into Russian ports. The shipment was technically illegal under the blockade. If intercepted, the entire cargo could be seized. The financial loss would be ruinous. But Madame Clicquot had calculated the odds and decided the reward justified the risk. The ship made it through. The champagne arrived in St. Petersburg and Moscow before any other French house could resume exports. Russian aristocrats who had developed a taste for champagne during the occupation of France were eager customers. Tsar Alexander I himself became a devotee of Veuve Clicquot. The distinctive yellow label became synonymous with quality in the Russian court. Within months, Madame Clicquot had captured the single most lucrative champagne market outside France. Her competitors arrived later to find the market already claimed. This was not luck. This was strategic genius wrapped in logistical daring. Madame Clicquot understood that luxury markets are not built on product quality alone. They are built on timing, access, and the ability to create exclusive relationships before competition intensifies. She also understood that in moments of historical disruption, the rules are temporarily suspended, and those willing to move quickly can claim territory that would otherwise take decades to penetrate. By the 1820s, Veuve Clicquot dominated the Russian market. By the 1830s, champagne was flowing into England, where the aristocracy and the rising industrial bourgeoisie both embraced it as a marker of taste and prosperity. The British market, with its wealth and its appetite for French luxury, became the second pillar of champagne's international expansion. Germany followed, the Americas followed. Champagne houses opened foreign agents, established distribution networks, built relationships with importers and restaurateurs. By 1850, champagne was no longer a French regional line. It was an international phenomenon, sold across Europe and beyond, consumed by elites who had never seen the Champagne region, but who understood that to drink champagne was to participate in a global language of celebration.
Language invented in France, but now spoken everywhere. Power and wealth gathered. This was soft power before the term existed. Champagne did not conquer through armies or treaties. It conquered through seduction, through the carefully cultivated belief that to drink champagne was to align yourself with elegance, with victory, with the people who mattered. And once that belief took root, it became self-reinforcing. Champagne was prestigious because prestigious people drank it. Prestigious people drank it because it was prestigious. The loop closed. The Napoleonic Wars had ended in France's military defeat, but champagne had won. It had turned occupation into opportunity, defeat into expansion, and a regional product into the international standard for how the powerful celebrate their power. But as champagne conquered ballrooms, the vineyards themselves faced an invisible apocalypse. The crisis arrived quietly, without announcement, carried across an ocean in the roots of botanical specimens and ornamental vines.
It began in the 1860s in the vineyards of southern France, far from Champagne, but what started as a regional curiosity would become a continental catastrophe. Vines began to die, not from frost or disease in the recognizable sense, but from something subtler and more insidious. The leaves would yellow, the growth would slow, the grapes would wither on the vine, and within 2 or 3 years, the entire plant would be dead, its roots blackened and destroyed beneath the soil. Winemakers had no explanation. Agronomists were baffled. It seemed as though the vines were simply giving up, surrendering to an invisible enemy. The enemy had a name, Dactylosphaera vidifolii, phylloxera, a microscopic aphid barely visible to the naked eye, native to the eastern United States. In North America, native grapevines had evolved alongside this pest and developed resistance. Their roots could withstand the aphid's feeding without catastrophic damage. But European vines, Vitis vinifera, the species that had produced wine for millennia, had no such defenses. When phylloxera arrived in Europe, accidentally imported with American botanical specimens in the mid-19th century, it found a defenseless food supply. The aphid feeds on the roots of grapevines, piercing the tissue and sucking the sap. The damage allows fungal infections to take hold, the roots rot, the vine starves. And because phylloxera reproduces rapidly and spreads through the soil, an infestation can move from vine to vine, field to field, region to region with terrifying efficiency. By the 1870s, phylloxera had spread from southern France into Bordeaux, then Burgundy. By the 1880s, it had reached Champagne. Production collapsed. In 1874, Champagne had produced approximately 30 million bottles of wine. By 1895, that number had fallen to around 5 million. Vineyards that had been cultivated for generations stood barren. The soil itself seemed cursed. The economic devastation was immediate. Vineyard workers lost their livelihoods. Champagne houses saw their supply chains disintegrate. Small growers faced ruin. The entire social fabric of the Champagne region, built on centuries of viticulture, was unraveling. Desperate attempts at solutions followed. Some tried flooding their vineyards, believing the aphids could be drowned. It worked temporarily, but was impractical for most terroirs and ruinously expensive. Others injected the soil with carbon disulfide, a toxic chemical that killed the aphids but also poisoned the earth and required repeated applications. Some burned their fields entirely and replanted, only to watch the new vines die within a few years. Prayer was attempted. Nothing worked for long. The answer, when it finally came, was as elegant as it was humiliating. European winemakers would have to graft their precious Vitis vinifera vines onto American rootstock. The very continent that had brought the plague would provide the cure. American grapevines resistant to phylloxera could serve as the foundation, and European vines could be grafted onto them, creating a hybrid plant that combined American immunity with European fruit. It was a solution that worked, but it required replanting the entire wine-producing region of Europe. Vineyard by vineyard, row by row, the old vines were torn out and new grafted plants installed. The process took decades. For Champagne, replanting stretched from the 1890s well into the 1910s. An entire generation of vineyards spent their working lives not making wine, but rebuilding the foundation of an industry. By the time the vineyards returned to productivity in the early 20th century, something subtle had changed. The terroir was not quite the same. The genetic diversity that had existed before phylloxera, hundreds of local varietals, each adapted to microclimates and specific soils, had been lost. The replanting focused on the 3 main grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier.
Became genetically simpler, more uniform, more vulnerable to future shocks. The lesson was ecological and existential. Champagne, for all its luxury and carefully cultivated mystique, was fragile. It depended on monoculture, on a narrow band of climate, on soil chemistry and microbial balance. A single microscopic insect, carried by accident across an ocean, had nearly destroyed it. The image of Champagne as timeless, as inevitable, as eternal, had been revealed as illusion. Champagne was not invincible. It was lucky. And just as the vines were replanted, the world exploded into war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set in motion a chain of alliances, mobilizations, and ultimatums that within weeks engulfed Europe in a conflict no one fully understood and no one knew how to stop. By August, the armies were moving. By September, they had collided in northeastern France, along a line that would barely move for the next 4 years. The Western Front cut directly through the Champagne region. Picture the geography. Reims, the historic capital of Champagne, the city where French kings had been crowned for centuries, sought less than 10 miles from the front lines. Epernay, home to the great Champagne houses, was within artillery range.
the vineyards that had just been replanted after the phylloxera devastation, the vines that represented decades of patient labor, now became part of the battlefield. Trenches were carved through the chalky soil. Barbed wire stretched across fields where grapes had grown. Shell craters pocked the landscape. The First Battle of the Marne, fought in September 1914, was a desperate attempt by French and British forces to stop the German advance on Paris. The battle raged across the Champagne region. Hundreds of thousands of men clashed in fields and forests, and when the Germans finally retreated, the front stabilized into a line of trenches that would define the next 4 years of horror. The Marne had been saved, France had been saved, but Champagne had become a war zone. Rheims Cathedral, the Gothic masterpiece where kings had received their crowns, where the sacred and the political had intertwined for 8 centuries, became a target. German artillery shelled the cathedral repeatedly throughout the war. The roof caught fire in September 1914, and the lead covering melted, pouring down the walls like tears. The stone facade was pockmarked with shrapnel, sculptures were decapitated. The building, which had stood for 700 years, was gutted. It did not collapse entirely, but it was left a skeleton, a symbol of cultural destruction that shocked the world and became a powerful piece of Allied propaganda. This is where Champagne's story intersects with mechanized death on an industrial scale. The cellars beneath Rheims and Epernay, the deep chalk caves where Champagne was aged in cool darkness, became bomb shelters. Civilians fled underground when the shelling began, huddling in tunnels originally carved to store wine. Some spent weeks below ground, emerging only briefly to assess damage or retrieve supplies. Children were born in these cellars, the elderly died there. Champagne bottles lined the walls, silent witnesses to the war being fought above. And yet, impossibly, production continued. Workers, many of them women now that the men had been conscripted, still tended the vines, still harvested grapes, still turned bottles in the traditional riddling racks. They did this work under artillery fire. Shells would land in vineyards, throwing up geysers of earth and shrapnel. Workers would crouch, wait for the barrage to pass, then return to their labor. The Champagne houses remained operational not out of defiance or patriotism alone, but out of necessity. The workers needed wages, the region needed economic survival. Stopping production entirely would mean collapse. The surreal became normal. The juxtaposition of luxury and carnage, of delicate crystal and industrial slaughter, defined the era. French officers, British commanders, even some German soldiers in quieter sectors drank champagne in the trenches. It was issued as part of rations during major offensives, intended to boost morale before men went over the top into machine gun fire. The logic was both practical and absurd. A sip of champagne before probable death, a taste of civilization before the meat grinder. Some officers toasted each other in dugouts lit by candles, the bubbles rising in muddy glasses while outside the night erupted with flares and explosions. The Battle of the Marne in May 1914 was partially credited with saving France, and in the mythology that followed, French soldiers' morale, sustained in part by wine rations including champagne, was celebrated as a factor in the victory. Whether champagne actually made a military difference is impossible to measure, but the story became part of the legend. Champagne had not merely survived the war, it had fought in it.
Photographs from the era, archived and haunting, show officers in dress uniforms standing in ruined vineyards, holding bottles of champagne against backdrops of shattered trees and cratered earth. The contrast is almost unbearable. Elegance framed by annihilation, celebration in the presence of corpses, the human capacity to perform ritual even when surrounded by apocalypse. This is where Champagne's dual identity fully crystallized. It was no longer merely a luxury. It was also tragedy. It was celebration and death intertwined. It was the drink you shared before an offensive that would kill half your battalion. It was the toast made in a dugout that might collapse from the next shell. It was resilience, yes, but also the stubborn insistence that human beings will grasp at beauty, even when beauty makes no sense. When the war finally ended on November 11, 1918, over 16 million people were dead. The Champagne region had been devastated. Vineyards were minefields, villages were rubble. Rheims Cathedral stood roofless, a monument to survival and loss. The chalk caves were still full of refugees, still smelling of fear and damp stone. But the Champagne houses did not wait to rebuild. They began almost immediately to craft the story of their survival. This was not cynical, or rather it was both sincere and strategic. The war had genuinely tested Champagne to the breaking point, and the region had endured. But that endurance could be marketed. It could become part of the brand. Advertisements in the 1920s began to feature imagery of Rheims Cathedral in ruins, of workers harvesting grapes under fire, of soldiers toasting in trenches.
The messaging was clear. Champagne had survived the worst humanity could inflict. It had been there in the darkest hours. It had endured bombardment, occupation, destruction, and still the bubbles rose. To drink champagne now was not merely indulgence. It was solidarity with resilience. It was a toast to survival itself. The truth was darker and more complicated. Workers had died. Vineyards had been poisoned with chemicals and munitions. The war had traumatized an entire generation. But trauma does not sell bottles. Resilience does. Heroism does. The narrative of champagne enduring became the narrative that mattered, and within a decade, the war's horrors were softened into brand mythology. Champagne in the trenches became champagne on the victory podium. The drink of soldiers became the drink of peace, and the companies that had kept producing through bombardment emerged not weakened but strengthened, their brands now wrapped in the language of survival and defiance. This is how tragedy becomes marketing. This is how suffering becomes story. The human beings who endured the war are remembered, if at all, as background to the product's resilience. The war did not make champagne noble, but it made champagne mythic, and mythology, once established, is more powerful than truth. From the ruins of one war, champagne rose, polished, mythologized, and ready for the next battlefield, the party. The 1920s began in the shadow of death. 16 million dead from the Great War, entire villages emptied of young men, an influenza pandemic that killed tens of millions more. Europe was exhausted, the world was grieving, and then somewhere in that grief, a decision was made, collective and unspoken. If we survived, we might as well live. What followed was not merely celebration, it was defiance, a decade of excess as armor against memory, a decade of speed, sound, and sensation loud enough to drown out the echoes of artillery. The Roaring Twenties were not innocent, they were desperate, and champagne became the soundtrack, poured in glasses that trembled with jazz and laughter and the frantic energy of people trying to forget. In the United States, the 21st of January 1920 marked the beginning of Prohibition. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act provided enforcement mechanisms. America, in theory, went dry. In practice, it went underground. Speakeasies sprouted like mushrooms in the dark. Hidden bars behind unmarked doors, accessed through code words and peepholes, where jazz bands played until dawn and the alcohol flowed as freely as it had before, only now with the added thrill of illegality. Champagne, real and counterfeit, became the drink of these clandestine spaces. It was smuggled through Canada, shipped from the Caribbean, bootlegged by organized crime networks that treated Prohibition not as moral reform, but as the business opportunity of a lifetime. Al Capone, the Chicago gangster who became synonymous with Prohibition-era violence, built an empire on illegal alcohol. His operation smuggled champagne alongside whiskey and rum, supplying speakeasies across the Midwest. Capone understood that people would pay a premium for the illusion of sophistication, even in a basement club lit by dim bulbs and
cigarette smoke. Champagne in a speakeasy was not about taste, it was about performance. It was proof you could afford the real thing, or at least something labeled as such. Because Prohibition created another problem, counterfeits. Cheap sparkling wine, often domestically produced, was bottled with fake French labels and sold as champagne. The quality was frequently abysmal, but in the semi-darkness of an illegal bar, few customers could tell the difference or cared to complain. The champagne houses in France watched in frustration as their brand was diluted by imposters, but there was little they could do. The American market was closed legally and corrupted practically. Yet the cultural associations held. Champagne, even fake champagne, still signified glamour, and glamour was the currency of the age. In Paris, far from Prohibition's constraints, the 20s roared even louder. The city became the capital of the avant-garde, a magnet for artists, writers, musicians, and exiles from across the world. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Josephine Baker, names that would define the era, all drank champagne in the cafes and nightclubs of Montparnasse and Montmartre. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, is drenched in champagne, the drink appearing at nearly every party, every moment of excess, every doomed toast to the American dream. Josephine Baker, the American-born dancer who became the sensation of Paris, performed at the Folies Bergère in costumes that scandalized and mesmerized. Her shows were champagne-soaked spectacles of jazz, sexuality, and Art Deco aesthetics. The audience drank, the performers drank. Champagne became inseparable from the image of Paris as the city where liberation,
sexual, artistic, social, was not only possible, but celebrated. And then there were the flappers, young women with bobbed hair and short skirts who smoked cigarettes in public, danced the Charleston until their feet bled, and drank champagne as an act of rebellion. The flapper was the emblem of female modernity in the 1920s, a rejection of Victorian repression and Edwardian propriety. To drink champagne was to claim space in a world that had told women to stay quiet, stay covered, stay home. The image of a flapper holding a champagne coupe, one hand on her hip, cigarette in the other, became iconic. It appeared in advertisements, in fashion illustrations, in films. Champagne was marketed directly to women as the drink of independence, sophistication, and sexual autonomy. The champagne houses responded with brilliant strategic shifts. They modernized their branding. Out went the ornate Victorian labels. In came Art Deco, sleek lines, geometric patterns, bold typography. The bottles themselves became objects of modern design. Advertisements featured women, stylish, confident, unchaperoned, drinking champagne in settings that suggested freedom rather than domesticity. Pommery, Moat, and other houses commissioned posters from leading graphic artists. Champagne was no longer just French, it was modern, it was now. But beneath the glitter was violence. The same bootleggers who smoked champagne into speakeasies fought turf wars with Tommy guns and car bombs. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, February 14, 1929, saw 7 men executed by Capone's rivals in a garage, their bodies left in pools of blood. The alcohol that filled champagne glasses at glamorous parties was transported through networks soaked in brutality. Every bottle that arrived in a speakeasy had passed through hands that killed to protect their supply chains. And the decade ended as it had to. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. The party stopped. The jazz weren't silent. The floppers put their hair up and their hemlines down. The Great Depression arrived like a cold wind through an open door, and suddenly champagne, symbol of excess, of waste, of everything the decade had been, looked obscene. Champagne had thrived on euphoria and amnesia, but memory, like debt, eventually comes due. The 20s had been a decade of champagne poured so fast it spilled over the rim, wasted with abandon. The 30s would be different, sober, hungry, and champagne would have to learn once again to survive in a world that no longer wanted to celebrate. And then the music stopped. The Great Depression came, then another war, and champagne learned to whisper instead of shout. The Second World War began on September 1, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war 2 days later, but for 9 months the conflict remained strangely static in the West, a period historians call the Phoning War. Then on May 10, 1940, Germany launched its offensive through the Low Countries and into France. The speed of the collapse was shocking. Paris fell on June 14th. An armistice was signed on June 22. By the end of June, northern France, including the entire Champagne region, was under German occupation. For the Champagne
houses, the nightmare had returned. Once again, their cellars, their vineyards, their livelihoods sought in a war zone. But this time was different. This was not bombardment from a distance. This was occupation. German soldiers in the streets of Reims and Epernay, Wehrmacht officers requisitioning wine, Nazi administrators overseeing production. The enemy was not across no man's land. The enemy was at the door, with paperwork and requisition orders and the implicit threat of violence if cooperation was not forthcoming. The moral calculus was brutal and immediate. Refuse and risk destruction. Cooperate and survive, but at what cost? Most chose survival. This is the chapter of Champagne's history that was quietly buried for decades, the story the marketing departments did not want told. But the archives do not lie, and historians have slowly reconstructed what happened in those years between 1940 and 1944. The champagne houses sold to the Germans. They sold millions of bottles. They hosted Nazi officers at banquets. They kept production running under German oversight, their workers' labor feeding the Third Reich's appetite for the symbols of civilization, even as it committed industrialized genocide. The Germans were enthusiastic customers. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and one of Hitler's most powerful subordinates, personally looted champagne cellars, taking hundreds of thousands of bottles back to Germany for his own collections and for distribution among the Nazi elite. Adolf Hitler himself, ironically, did not drink alcohol, but champagne flowed at state dinners and military celebrations throughout the occupied territories. The Reich understood propaganda. They understood that to drink champagne, to dine well, to perform the rituals of sophistication, was to assert that they were not merely conquerors, but inheritors of European civilization. For the champagne producers, each bottle sold was a compromise. Each shipment was a calculation. Keep the workers employed or let them starve.
keep the business alive or watch it be seized and operated by German administrators, collaborate in the present or lose everything for the future. Some resisted in small ways. Workers occasionally sabotaged quality, sending inferior vintages labeled as premium. Some sellers hid their best bottles behind false walls, reserving them for after liberation. Secret codes were passed through labels and paperwork, small acts of defiance that felt meaningful to those who performed them, but changed little in the larger machinery of occupation. And then there were those who resisted openly. Robert Jean de Vogue, the director of Moet and Chandon, was one of the few champagne industry leaders who joined the French resistance. Born into a noble family, educated, sophisticated, de Vogue could have collaborated comfortably. Many men of his class did, but he chose differently. He passed intelligence to the Allies. He helped coordinate resistance operations. He used his position to shield workers and sabotage German efforts where possible. In 1943, the Gestapo arrested him. He was interrogated, tortured, and sent to a concentration camp. He survived, barely, and returned to France after liberation in 1945. His courage was real. His suffering was real. He became, in the post-war narrative, the symbol of Champagne's resistance, the proof that the industry had not been entirely complicit. But here's the uncomfortable truth. While de Vogue was in a concentration camp, Moet and Chandon continued to sell champagne to the Germans. The company did not stop production. It did not refuse orders. Managers made decisions to keep the business operational, to protect the workers, to survive. De Vogue's heroism and the company's collaboration coexisted, simultaneous and contradictory, because institutions are not individuals and survival is not simple. Maurice Doillard, who managed Pommery during the occupation, took a different approach. He openly collaborated with the Germans, hosting Nazi officers, ensuring smooth production, doing everything required to keep the business running and the workers employed. After the war, he was not prosecuted. He argued, and many accepted, that his choices had prevented worse outcomes: executions, deportations, the complete destruction of the house. Was he a collaborator? Yes. Was he also protecting lives? Possibly. The moral clarity we demand from history becomes murky when examined close up. And in some cellars, hidden beneath Reims, there were other forms of resistance. Downed Allied pilots were sheltered in the tunnels. Jewish families were hidden in the chalk caves where champagne aged in silence. Messages were passed through networks that used the champagne trade as cover. These acts were rare, dangerous, and often discovered too late to save those involved. But they happened. The same cellars that stored bottles destined for Berlin also hit people the Reich wanted dead. The liberation of France began with the D-Day.
Landings on June 6, 1944. By late August, Paris was free. Reims and Epernay were liberated shortly after. Photographs from those days show American and British soldiers being handed bottles of champagne by grateful civilians, toasts made in streets still scarred by occupation. The champagne houses immediately pivoted their messaging. The collaborations were downplayed, erased, or reframed as necessary survival. The resistance stories were amplified. De Vogue became a hero, which he was, but also a convenient symbol that allowed the industry to avoid deeper reckoning. The post-war narrative became Champagne endured. Champagne resisted where it could. Champagne celebrated liberation. The darker truths, the shipments to Berlin, the banquets for Nazi officers, the compromises made daily for years, were filed away in archives that few would consult for decades. This is not to condemn those who made impossible choices under occupation. It is to acknowledge that luxury, like everything else, survives by bending. Champagne bent toward power, whichever power held the guns. It had done so during the Revolution. It had done so under Napoleon. It did so under the Nazis. And when liberation came, it bent toward the liberators, offering itself as the drink of freedom, as if the previous 4 years had been nothing but quiet resistance. Champagne's collaboration was not unique. It was simply the champagne version of what most industries, most institutions, most individuals did under occupation. They survived. When the war ended, champagne was ready, bottles chilled, corks waiting, as if the darkness had never happened. The post-war decades brought a kind of amnesia, collective and necessary. Europe rebuilt, economies recovered, the Marshall Plan poured American dollars into reconstruction, and as prosperity returned, so did the appetite for luxury. The 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s became champagne's golden age, not because the wine improved, it had already been perfected, but because the market exploded. The middle class expanded, air travel became accessible, television brought images of wealth and sophistication into ordinary living rooms, and champagne, which had once been the exclusive domain of aristocrats and industrialists, began to position itself as achievable aspiration. You might not own a yacht, but you could afford a bottle of champagne for your wedding. You might not dine at the Ritz, but you could toast the new year with something that sparkled. Champagne became the drink of milestones, weddings, anniversaries, graduations, New Year's Eve, the moments when ordinary people wanted to feel extraordinary, even briefly.
The champagne houses understood this shift and marketed accordingly. The product was no longer sold only on heritage and terroir, it was sold on emotion, on the idea that champagne could transform a moment, elevate it, make it memorable. And then champagne discovered a new stage, sports. On June 18, 1967, at the Circuit de Remsgau, a racetrack built on the plains of Champagne, Formula One driver Dan Gurney won the Belgian Grand Prix. In a spontaneous gesture, he shook a bottle of champagne and sprayed it over the crowd and his fellow competitors. The image was joyful, chaotic, exuberant. Moet and Chandon, which had sponsored the race, recognized the marketing potential immediately. By the 1970s, champagne spraying on the podium had become Formula One's signature ritual, replicated at nearly every race, broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide. This was genius. Champagne was no longer just consumed, it was performed. The act of spraying champagne, wasting it, in fact, became a symbol of victory so powerful that no other drink could compete. The gesture said, I have so much success, so much wealth, so much confidence, that I can afford to throw away what others save for special occasions. It was conspicuous consumption distilled into a single theatrical moment, repeated week after week, season after season, until the association between champagne and victory became reflexive. Celebrity culture amplified champagne's reach. James Bond, the suave British spy created by Ian Fleming, drank champagne in nearly every film, beginning with Dr. No in 1962. Bond did not drink beer, he did not drink whiskey at celebrations, he drank champagne, usually Bollinger or Dom Perignon, and the association between espionage, sophistication, and sparkling wine was sealed in the cultural imagination. Marilyn Monroe was rumored to have bathed in champagne, a claim that was almost certainly false but became part of her mythology. Truth mattered less than the story. The story sold bottles. By the 1980s, champagne was no longer a product of individual houses competing independently. It was becoming a corporate empire. In 1987, a merger created LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, a luxury conglomerate that brought together champagne, cognac, fashion, and leather goods under a single corporate umbrella. Moet and Chandon, Dom Perignon,
Clicquot, Krug, and Ruinart all became part of a portfolio managed not by winmakers, but by executives trained in brand management, global logistics, and shareholder value. This was the moment champagne fully transitioned from craft to commodity. The language of terroir and tradition remained in the marketing, but the reality was industrial. Production was scaled to meet global demand. Vineyards that had once supplied small family houses were now contracted to multinational corporations. The emphasis shifted from vintage variation, the idea that each year's harvest was unique, to consistency. Consumers wanted champagne to taste the same every time, and industrial blending techniques made that possible. The legal protections around the name champagne tightened. The Committee Champagne, the industry's regulatory body, fought aggressively to ensure that only sparkling wine produced in the Champagne region of France using méthode champenoise could be called champagne. Lawsuits were filed against producers in California, Australia, and South America who labeled their products as champagne. The European Union formalized the name as a protected designation of origin, and international treaties extended that protection, though enforcement remained uneven. By the 1990s, champagne was everywhere. Over 200 million bottles were produced annually. It was exported to more than 190 countries. It appeared in duty-free shops and airports, in hotel minibars, in corner liquor stores, and Michelin-starred restaurants. Champagne had achieved something almost paradoxical. It was both exclusive and ubiquitous, a luxury product that nearly anyone in a wealthy country could afford at least occasionally. But something had been lost in the scaling, the connection to place, to the specific chalk soils of Champagne, to the families who had tended vines for generations. These became background details in a marketing narrative rather than the lived reality of production. Champagne was no longer primarily French. It was global. It was a brand. It was a lifestyle symbol untethered from geography, existing more powerfully in advertising and Instagram posts than in the actual vineyards where grapes were still grown and harvested by hand. The golden age was real. Champagne had never been more successful, more profitable, more globally recognized. But success came with a cost, subtle and rarely discussed. Champagne had become what it had always threatened to become. Not a drink, but a product. Not a place, but a logo. But as champagne conquered the world's parties, something darker was brewing in its shadow. Behind every bottle of champagne, behind the golden liquid, the elegant label, the carefully crafted mythology, is labor, human hands, bent backs, hours spent in cold and rain, in the unforgiving repetition of vineyard work that cannot be automated without destroying the quality that justifies the price. Champagne is legally required to be hand-harvested. The grapes must be picked carefully, transported in small crates to prevent bruising, pressed gently to extract only the clearest juice. This is not romantic. This is necessity. But necessity does not pay well. The workers who harvest champagne grapes are often seasonal migrants, arriving from Eastern Europe, North Africa, and other regions where wages are even lower than in France. They are paid approximately 10 to 12 euros per hour for back-breaking labor that begins at dawn and continues until the light fails. The work is physically exhausting. The season is short, sometimes only a few weeks, and the pressure is immense. A late frost or early rain can destroy an entire harvest, so when the grapes are ready, they must be picked immediately, regardless of weather, regardless of fatigue. These workers do not drink champagne. They cannot afford the product they create. A bottle that sells for 40 euros in a shop or 400 euros in a nightclub represents days of their labor. The disparity is not hidden. It is simply ignored, papered over by marketing narratives that emphasize heritage and craftsmanship while erasing the people whose hands make the craft possible. The tension between labor and capital in Champagne is not new. It exploded into violence in 1911, during what became known as the Champagne Riots. The riots began in January 1911, triggered by a complex dispute over which grapes could legally be used to produce champagne and where those grapes could be grown. Vineyard owners in the Aube region south of the traditional Marne heartland were being excluded from the Champagne appellation, despite having grown grapes for decades. Simultaneously, small growers in the Marne accused the large champagne houses of importing cheaper grapes from outside the region and blending them into champagne to maximize profits, while keeping prices paid to local growers artificially low. On April 11, 1911, the tensions exploded. Thousands of vineyard workers and small growers
rioted in Ailly, Epernay, and surrounding villages. They attacked the warehouses of champagne houses, smashing bottles, destroying equipment, setting fires. The violence was not random. It was targeted at the symbols of corporate power, at the houses that had grown wealthy while the workers who supplied their grapes remained poor. The French government deployed troops. Soldiers occupied the Champagne region, and for weeks the area was under military control. The riots were eventually suppressed, and compromises were negotiated, expanding the appellation boundaries, tightening controls on imported grapes, but the underlying inequality remained. The workers returned to the vineyards, the houses returned to profit. The imbalance of power did not shift. More than a century later, the structure persists. The champagne industry is divided between the Grands Marques, the famous houses like Moet, Veuve Clicquot, Bollinger, and the Récoltants Manipulants, small grower-producers who own their vineyards and make their own champagne. The Grands Marques buy most of their grapes from contracted growers, controlling the market and dictating prices. For small growers, the options are limited: sell to the big houses at the prices offered, or try to produce and market their own champagne, a path that requires capital, expertise, and access to distribution networks that favor established brands. The environmental cost is also mounting. Champagne, like all industrial agriculture, relies on monoculture. The region is dominated by 3 grape varieties: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, planted in dense, continuous rows across thousands of hectares. This creates vulnerability. Pesticides and herbicides are used extensively to protect the vines from disease and pests. The Champagne region has among the highest rates of chemical use in French viticulture, a reality that sits uncomfortably beside marketing narratives that emphasize purity and tradition. And then there is climate change. The Champagne region's marginal climate, which once made viticulture difficult but produced grapes with high acidity and delicate flavors, is warming. Harvest dates have shifted earlier by nearly 2 weeks over the past 3 decades. Warmer temperatures mean riper grapes, lower acidity, higher alcohol content. The signature crispness of Champagne, the bright acidity that defines its character, is threatened. Producers are adopting, experimenting with new rootstocks, adjusting blending techniques, exploring previously unsuitable vineyard sites further north, but the changes are coming faster than adaptation. Climate change does not respect appellations or centuries of tradition. It simply alters the conditions, and the question becomes, at what point does champagne stop tasting like champagne? Behind the golden label, then, is a system built on inequality, ecological fragility, and the quiet extraction of value from those least able to resist. Every bottle represents labor paid poorly, soil stressed by chemicals, a climate destabilizing. These facts do not make champagne evil. They make it what it has always been, a luxury built on hidden costs. And then, in nightclubs and boardrooms, champagne became something else entirely, a weapon. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once, beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s. Champagne had always been a marker of status, but in this new era it became something more aggressive, more theatrical, more divorced from pleasure.
It became a tool for competitive consumption, a way to publicly demonstrate wealth, not by enjoying luxury, but by destroying it. Welcome to the age of bottle service. In nightclubs from Miami to Monaco, from Las Vegas to Moscow, a new ritual emerged. Groups would reserve tables, not to sit quietly, but to perform. They would order champagne, not by the bottle, but by the case. Moet, Dom Perignon, Cristal, Armand de Brignac. The bottles would arrive on trays carried by waitresses in high heels and minimal clothing, often accompanied by sparklers, strobe lights, and choreographed processions designed to draw every eye in the room. The bottles themselves glowed, backlit by LEDs embedded in the service trays. This was not about taste. No one at these tables was savoring the terroir or discussing the vintage. This was about spectacle, about being seen ordering the most expensive thing on the menu, about proving in the most public way possible that you had money to burn. And then they burned it. Literally. Champagne spraying, which had begun as a spontaneous gesture of joy on a Formula One podium in 1967, became weaponized in nightclubs. Bottles costing 500, 1,000, 5,000 euros were shaken and sprayed over crowds, over tables, over strangers. The liquid arced through the hair, sticky and wasteful, soaking clothing and hair. The point was not celebration. The point was demonstration. I can afford to waste what you cannot afford to buy. Some
Clubs took it further. Champagne showers became a service, a purchasable experience where staff would pour entire bottles over a customer's head while cameras captured the moment for social media. The customer was not drinking. They were drowning in their own wealth, performing excess for an audience of thousands online. This was champagne as status warfare, and the psychology behind it was older than money itself. The potlatch, the conspicuous destruction of resources to assert dominance. But where traditional potlatch ceremonies destroyed goods to redistribute status within a community, this version destroyed goods to humiliate those who could not afford to participate. It was class violence dressed as a party. The clientele who drove this culture were themselves symptoms of a particular historical moment. Russian oligarchs who had seized state assets during the chaotic privatization of the 1990s arrived in Western capitals with fortunes so large they distorted local economies. They bought football clubs, real estate, and champagne, cases of it, shipped to private jets and super yachts. Cristal, produced by Louis Roederer, became their drink of choice, its clear bottle and minimalistic label a favorite in Moscow's most exclusive clubs. Then came a rupture. In 2006, Frederick Rozad, managing director of Louis Roederer, gave an interview to The Economist in which he expressed ambivalence about Cristal's association with hip-hop culture, suggesting the connection might damage the brand's image. The statement was widely interpreted as racist, a thinly veiled dismissal of Black artists and audiences who had embraced Cristal in their music and lifestyles. Jay-Z, the rapper and entrepreneur, responded by boycotting Cristal and removing it from his clubs and businesses. The move was both personal and strategic. If champagne houses wanted to benefit from hip-hop's cultural cachet without respecting the artists who created it, then hip-hop would build its own champagne. In 2014, Jay-Z acquired Armand de Brignac, known as Ace of Spades for its distinctive gold bottle. The brand had been founded in 2006, perfectly positioned to fill the void left by Cristal's miscalculation. Ace of Spades became the champagne of choice for a new generation of wealthy consumers, particularly those who had been alienated by traditional luxury brands' reluctance to fully embrace them. Bottles sold for 300 euros at retail, but in nightclubs the prices soared. A 15-liter Midas bottle, equivalent to 20 standard bottles, could cost 40,000 euros or more. This was champagne fully detached from its origins. The terroir, the chalk soils, the patient labor of riddling and disgorgement, all of it was irrelevant. What mattered was the size of the bottle, the color of the label, the number at the bottom of the bill. Champagne had become a numeric value in a status competition, no different than a limited edition sneaker or a rare watch. Gulf royalty joined the spectacle. In Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, clubs catered to princelings and their entourages with champagne lists that read like ransom demands. Bottles were presented like trophies. Tables were stages. The champagne itself, its flavor, its bubbles, its history, was secondary to the performance of ordering it. And then came the cryptocurrency millionaires. In 2017 and 2018, as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies surged, a new class of suddenly wealthy young men flooded into nightclubs with money that felt virtual, unearned, and infinite. They ordered Nebuchadnezzar bottles, 15 liters, equivalent to 20 bottles, not because they wanted to drink them, but because they could. The champagne was poured, sprayed, wasted, photographed, and forgotten by morning. This era of champagne was not about enjoyment. It was about destruction as proof of wealth. It was late-stage capitalism's purest expression, the transformation of luxury into ammunition, of celebration into combat, of desire into a game where the only rule was that someone else must lose. The champagne houses, for their part, were complicit. They created ultra-premium cuvées specifically to feed this market.
Dom Perignon released P2 and P3 vintages, aged champagnes priced at €500 or more. Moët launched limited editions. Smaller houses scrambled to create prestige bottlings. The industry had discovered that there was no ceiling to what people would pay, as long as scarcity and status were built into the product. Champagne had become what it had always threatened to become, not a drink to be shared, but a weapon to be wielded, a tool for marking territory in the invisible war of who matters and who does not. So after 3 centuries of myth-making, what is champagne, really? Strip away the marketing, the mythology, the golden labels and crystal flutes. Remove the celebrity endorsements, the Formula One podiums, the nightclub performances. Look past the revolution and the wars, the monks and the widows.
Oligarchs and the influencers. What remains? At its core, champagne is fermented grape juice with trapped carbon dioxide. It is Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, grown in chalk soil under marginal climatic conditions, harvested by hand, pressed gently, fermented twice, aged in cellars carved from limestone, turned bottle by bottle over weeks until the sediment collects and can be expelled. It is a technical achievement, a product of extraordinary patience and accumulated knowledge. The method champenoise requires more than 200 individual manipulations per bottle. The labor is real, the craft is real. And the wine itself? It is legitimately special. The bubbles are finer than in most sparkling wines. The acidity is precise. The flavors, when the champagne is well made, are complex. Notes of brioche, citrus, minerality, sometimes almond or honey. Champagne at its best is delicious. This is not a lie. The pleasure is genuine. But champagne has never been only a drink. It has always been more than the liquid in the bottle. It has been a social technology, a tool for marking class, for performing status, for dividing the world into those who belong and those who do not. From the court of Louis XV to the speakeasies of Chicago, from the trenches of World War I to the nightclubs of Dubai, champagne has been wherever power wanted to celebrate itself. The question, then, is not whether champagne is good or bad. It is, what do we celebrate when we drink it? Are we tasting the terroir, the centuries of refinement, the skill of the cellar master? Or are we performing a ritual we barely understand, lifting a glass because we have been taught that this is what sophisticated people do, that this is how important moments are marked? Champagne has always been whatever its moment required. It was sacred when kings needed divine legitimacy. It was revolutionary when the old order fell. It was resilient when survival required mythology. It was liberated when women needed symbols of independence. It was victorious when athletes needed a gesture. It was exclusive when wealth needed a boundary. And now, in an age of viral videos and competitive consumption, it is spectacle. The liquid has remained largely unchanged, but the stories we tell about it shift with each generation, each market, each new class of consumers willing to pay for the promise that champagne will make them feel, however briefly, exceptional. And yet, beneath every bottle, the contradictions persist. The workers who harvest the grapes cannot afford the product they create. The vineyards that produce champagne are threatened by the climate crisis that luxury consumption accelerates. The houses that market heritage and tradition are owned by conglomerates that answer to shareholders, not soil. The drink sold as French cultural patrimony is consumed most enthusiastically by people who have never seen Reims, who could not locate the Champagne region on a map, who drink it because a music video or a movie or an Instagram influencer told them it was what success looks like. There are still people whose labor goes unrecognized in every pour. There are still ecological costs buried in every harvest. There are still questions about who profits and who pays, about what is preserved and what is sacrificed when craft becomes commodity. These contradictions do not make champagne uniquely evil. They make it exemplary. Champagne is capitalism in a bottle, ingenuity and exploitation, beauty and inequality, pleasure and cost, all mixed together and sealed with wire. It is what happens when desire is industrialized, when celebration becomes market segment, when a regional wine becomes a global symbol detached from the place that made it possible. The bubbles rise. They always have. They catch the light. They burst at the surface and disappear, like every empire, like every party, like every moment we try to hold on to by turning it into ritual.
Champagne does not judge. It does not carry the weight of our contradictions. It simply is, fermented, pressurized, poured, consumed, and forgotten. We are the ones who decided it meant something. We are the ones who built the mythology. We are the ones who chose, again and again, to make desire fizz. And as you drift toward sleep, the question remains, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. When we trap lightning in a bottle and sell it back to ourselves, what exactly are we celebrating? The bottle is still there, cold and waiting. The choice of what it means is ours.